Hello and welcome to React 101 Introduction to React. My name is Ashutosh and I am a full stack JavaScript developer. I have been using React for more than 2 years, and in this course we will be learning how to get started with React. You can find more about me and the work I have done in my portfolio. I'm pretty excited to welcome you all to this course, and I think it's going to be a wonderful journey. Hope to see you soon. Hello and welcome. In this section, we will cover how to set up the development environment to use React. There are two main ways that we are going to use in this course. One is to use an online IDE called Code Sandbox, and the other way is to set up all the things needed to get a React project up and running on your local machine. Firstly, let's cover the Code Sandbox one if you guys want to use the online ID instead of configuring a local system and setup. So I'm going to head over to Google and search for Code Sandbox. As I'm already logged in with GitHub, it will create a new project for me for React, and my ID will launch in a few moments. It's all set up. In this section, on the right side, it is showing me a preview of my application which is created using React. On the very left, this is our Explore section where we can check out the files and whatnot. You can also add dependency. These are the npm packages, Node Package Manager dependencies. You can see there are 3: React DOM, and React scripts. We will cover them later. But for now, if you look at, we have a file called app.js, which include some code that render this piece of UI on the right. Cool. All the progress that you will make in this section will be saved in Code Sandbox if you have signed in using any method that they provide. I recommend using GitHub because you don't have to save your password. Hello and welcome again. In this section, we will cover how to set up the development environment so that you can design React component on your local machine. For this exercise, we will need few things that is already set up in your machine. One of them is called Node.js, which is a runtime for JavaScript. With Node, there comes a package manager called npm, which is Node Package Manager. Using Node Package Manager, you can install a command line tool called create react app. As I have already installed it, so I'm not going to install it again. Instead, I'm going to use it to create a new React project. It's going to go ahead and download all the requirements needed for a React project and set it up for us. In few moments, we can see that we have a project which is configured for all the requirements and dependencies that are needed to use a React project. After the setup is completed, head over and cd into the newly created directory and open up your favorite code editor. Mine is Visual Studio Code because it is awesome. I recommend you guys to use it. If you look at the folder structure for this project, you see there are 3 main folders. One, node modules, which is obviously the package and dependency that we needed for this project. One is called public. It contains an HTML file, couple of logos, and a manifest file. More on that later. The main interesting piece is the source file. Inside source, you can check out that there is a index.js file, and then there is a app.js file. Before we head over and get deeper into the code, let's try and run this project that we just created. Use npm start to start the project. It will open the browser for you, and voila, you can see that the application is up and running. This is a demo application. We will be using this as a starting point to learn how a React component works, how to deal with rendering, how to use state and props, and what are those. Hope to see you soon. Hey guys, in this section we will be covering what is React. React is a JavaScript library which is open source and maintained by Facebook. It is a library to design UI. It's not a framework, it's just a library. It only deals with how to render the UI. That is all. We will be covering in future chapter in detail how the UI is written or created using React. Hey guys, we will cover why we use React. React is a JavaScript library for building UI components. React is declarative. React makes it painless to create UI component. By being declarative, it is easy to reason about the state of your application and to debug the problems. React is component based. The whole concept is that you break your UI into isolated components that you can compose to build a more complex application. The state for the component resides in itself, so the complex application can be broken down in such part it is easier to maintain and use. The main philosophy of React is that you learn in once and write anywhere. Because React is a library and it only deals with the UI itself, it doesn't present you or offer you with the other stuff like where to render and how to deal with routing and all that stuff. So if you learn the main API of React, you can use it to build web application using React. You can use to create desktop application using a framework called Electron. You can use it to either create mobile application using a tool called React Native. So the concept will be same, that we make UI components, compose them to create application, but you can write it in any platform, mobile, web, or even desktop applications. Hey guys, welcome back to React 101, the fundamentals. Today we will going to cover the topics that we introduced in the slides via examples. So as you saw in the last lecture that you can use either Code Sandbox, the online editor, to create React application, or you can use Create React App to set up a React project locally. In this lecture and moving forward, I will be using Create React App to set up the local project and using that project to create demo components. I have opened the project, and if you look at the structure, this is the structure that you got. I have edited the index file, the main file, and clean it up. So we are going to render our first React component right in here. For that, I'm going to import React library from the package. We also going to need React DOM And then we are going to use React DOM to render our first component. This render method takes two arguments. First, the React component, and second, the DOM in the tree in the JavaScript where we want to render that component. So I'm going to create the element and we are going to do rendering of that in a particular div that we already have in our HTML5 file. If you see, we have this empty div, so we are going to render our application, the component, in here. For that we have to select it using query selector. It's compiling, and on the left you can see that we have hello world rendered to the screen. This is the simplest React component that you can see. We are using React DOM render to render a component element to a DOM node which is created in the HTML file. If you inspect, you will see that here we have our newly created element, and this will change when I change it. That is a simple React component. Hello guys, welcome back. In this lecture, we will learn what is JSX. Introducing JSX. Consider this variable. We are declaring a constant element, and it is just looks like an HTML h1 containing hello world. It is called JSX, and it's a syntax extension to JavaScript. JSX produces React elements. What that all mean? If you look in the left, we have our hello world example, hello Mike, probably. This element is not HTML and neither it's a string. It's JSX, which is extension to the JavaScript language. It looks like HTML and you can use it to build your UI. The main thing about JSX is that you can embed JavaScript, any valid JavaScript expression, and React will evaluate that expression. What I mean by that is that if I made a constant called name and put it we can use it inside this JSX using curly braces. Anything inside this curly braces is evaluated as valid JavaScript, and it will work like any template. But the more powerful thing about JSX rather than a templating language is that it gives you all the power a JavaScript language have. You can use any valid JavaScript inside JSX. For example, if we create a function called format name, which takes a user as an object and use its first name and last name to create the full name. We can do that by simply using the function. In curly braces, we can put any valid JavaScript, and since function is a valid JavaScript, I can do that. it changes. You can also specify attributes inside JSX like we did with image. Because image is a valid HTML element, we can use it, and you can specify attributes, and every image has a source attribute. You can pass it as a string like we do in HTML, or you can even use the power of JSX to have dynamic variable, make it work. Any valid HTML attribute is a JSX, work in JSX. So if I give it a height of 100 pixel, it will work. You can also specify children in a JSX element. Like HTML have children, so does JSX. If a JSX tag doesn't have any children, we can close it by itself, so it's become a self-closing tag. But if something has children, we put we can also make an HTML or JSX element children of another. For that, we need both opening and closing tags. Here we have a JSX element div. Inside that we have another JSX element. One is image and other is paragraph. We will talk about later why we wrap these two elements inside of a div rather than having them alone. But that's it for JSX. Welcome back to React 101. In this lecture, we will cover what is rendering. Rendering elements. Elements are the smallest building block of React app. An element describes what do you want to see on the screen. For example, in this case, we want to show hello world on the screen. That is what we have described in line number 4 by creating an element. And then line number 6, rendering that element to the root node. Unlike browser DOM, React elements are plain object and pretty cheap to create. React DOM handles updating the UI on actual DOM, mapping it just like what an element states. For example, React DOM take care of updating DOM to match React elements. So for example, in our case, on line number 6, we have written the code which will take care of mapping the element which is created on line number 4 to actual DOM, as you can see on left hand side. Rendering an element into the DOM. Let's say we have a div with an ID root. This is what happening in here. For example, if we look at the main HTML file, you can see that on line number 31, we have a div with the ID root. And we are using that particular div to mounting or rendering our element. We call it root because all of our application logic, all our components will be rendering to that particular DOM node. Usually in React application, there is only one root node and the complete application, the main app, will be rendered there. To render the React element, we use this React DOM render function, and it displays the hello world. Now that we have rendered the element, what about updating it? React elements are immutable. Once you create an element, you cannot change its children or attribute. With whatever knowledge that we have to this point, if we want to change the element, we have to create new element every time. We can do that. For example, if we create a new element with a time in it, you can see that it is just static. If you want to change time or render a clock, we have to create this React element again and again and again. We can do that. If we were to update this component, we have to re-render it using React DOM with new element. To do that, we use set interval. Set interval takes a function and the amount of time which it will be called after that. Set interval takes a function which will be called after the interval specified as second argument. If we move our code for creating an element and rendering it inside this function, we might build a component that will render itself. Now if you look closely to the elements, you can see that only the string with date information is re-rendering or updating in this case. So we got to know that React only update what is needed to be updated. That is what is changing. In this case, only the date is changing on line number 7 because we are creating a new one. So that the only string is changing is the date one. Everything else remains the same. This is rendering in React. In future, we will not use this kind of pattern to update our application. Instead, we will use prop and state to update the React application. See you soon. Hey guys, welcome back to React 101. In this lecture, we will be covering what is component and prop. Component let you split the UI into reusable pieces, and it gives you the framework to think about component in isolation, the specific UI in isolation to the entire app. Conceptually, components are JavaScript function. As you can see in line number 4 to 6 that we have defined a function called welcome. It returns a markup which is JSX. Notice that the welcome is capitalized because every React component is capital case. We will discuss why it is this way later. The simplest way to define a component is to write a JavaScript function. Every React component does two things. It takes a single argument called props and return the JSX, the UI it wants to render. Because this function welcome is receiving a prop called props and returning the UI it wants to display, it is a valid React component. Also, it is camel case. We call these components function components because they are literally JavaScript functions. You can also describe or declare a function using ES6 classes. For doing that, you have to create a class that extend React component. Inside this, it is mandatory to implement a function called render, which will return the piece of UI that this component need to display. But in this lecture, we will covering the functional or function components, not the class components. To React, these both function component and class component are same. We need class component to do some extra things. We will discuss them in later lecture. In previous lecture, we have seen that we can render a JSX with just DOM element like div, like image or a paragraph. But as you can see on line number 14 that we are defining and using a user built component welcome. To use a component, you make it a JSX of it, making a tag because it doesn't contain any children, that is why it's self-closing. You can pass any attribute to this component that you just created and it will be available inside the function with props. For example, if I pass a variable, if I attach an attribute called name, Sam, you can see on the left hand side that our UI has updated. By defining the attribute and by defining an attribute on the component itself, you can use it via props. Anything that you will define here can be accessible using props. So if I define 23 here, I can use this Let's recap what happened in this example. We call react DOM render with a component welcome, giving it attribute name and age. In our welcome component that we declare in line number 4, we use it using prop, which is passed as argument to the component itself. And React DOM efficiently update the DOM to match hello Sam 23 years old. It is to be noted that always start component name with a capital letter. React treat components starting with lowercase letter as DOM tags. For example, div representing an HTML div, but welcome representing component and require welcome to be in scope. We can also compose the components. For example, we create an app component that render welcome many times. We can do that. So I am using again a function component. And I can use welcome inside this as many times as I want. And instead of using welcome to render to root node, we can use app to render in the root node. You can see that the UI updated on left. It is not looking good because we haven't passed any props yet. Let me You can see the 3 welcome components are rendering on the left. To recap, what we did is we created another function component called app, and inside app we have used 3 welcome components. We have given them each different attribute so that we can identify them, and this is what our UI look. If you look closely, you can see that we are repeating ourselves in component app. We can extract this and use JavaScript utilities like mapping. So if we have a object which has our users, array of users with name, age, Then we can use JavaScript utils map to map over users and returning. You can see that UI is updated on the left. What I have done is I have created an array with all the user information, and in line number 14 I have mapped over on that array to render multiple instances of welcome. We can totally do that because JSX allows us to use any valid JavaScript expression inside the curly braces. Because it is JavaScript, we can loop over things, we can conditionally render some things, and all the good stuff. If I open up the console, you will see that we have a error or warning from React. I personally love all the helpful warnings React will give you that help you avoid bugs. So it is saying that each child in a list should have a unique key. We can totally fix this component. What I have done here is to add unique ID to each user and then use that unique ID to assign a key to every welcome component. Because we are using welcome multiple times, React will complain if we won't provide key. React need this key to identify different instances of the components. What is the use of that? We will cover in later lectures. But for now, if we look at the console again, we have no errors or warning. So all good to go. As you can see that we can use JavaScript expression, the for loops, the filtering, every JavaScript thing inside a component, which gives us flexibility to making dynamic component very easily. Thank you guys, this is it for this lecture. Hey guys, hello and welcome to React 101. In this lecture, we will be learning what is state and lifecycle. If you recall, in previous section we have covered that how to render a component. As you can see on your screen that we have a clock element which is updating the time every second. If you recall the lecture previously, we have introduced a concept of component and how to update a component. In that section, we use what I call a set interval JavaScript method to update the DOM. To do that, we have rendered that element we created using React DOM render every time when a second has passed. So we use that set interval to call a function tick, as you can see on the screen, to render React element every second. In this lecture, we will be learning concept like state, which we are going to use to update the DOM element. In this section, we will be learning how to make the clock component truly reusable and encapsulated. It will set up its own timer and update itself every second. We can start by encapsulating how the clock should look. I will start by moving this component into a new one called clock and using that as the starting point. It is working, but it is missing a crucial requirement, which is that a clock should set up its own timer and update the UI every second. Ideally, we want to write this once and have clock update itself. So we don't have to use set interval to update it manually. To start this, we are going to add state to clock component. State is similar to probe, but it is private and fully controlled by the component. To convert a function component to a class, we need to follow 6 steps. To create a class component from a function one, we need to create an empty class. We start by using ES6 class keyword. We name it the same. We need to extend from the base class of React component. Every React class component needs to have a single method render. Render will return whatever the UI component wants to render. In this case, all the UI. Now we can remove our functional component, and as it is, our class component is working fine. Clock is now defined as a class rather than a function. The render method will be called each time an update happens. But as long as we render clock into the same DOM node, only a single instance of clock class will be used. This lets us use additional features like local state and lifecycle methods. Adding local state to class will require to do these steps. First, instead of using this new date directly, we are going to define the state in this component. To define the state, we use constructor, and inside the constructor we use this dot state to have an object. Before using this, we need to call super, which will call the instructor and initialize the base class. Don't forget to pass props to super. This will help it to initialize. Now we will move the time and date from our render method to this state. Now we will replace our usage of the date to use the state. Now you can see that it has stopped updating. The reason is because we have setting up the state in constructor, and constructor of a component only called once. We don't need this tick method to be its set interval anymore, and we can simply remove it. Our clock seems to be broken, but if you reload the page, the time seems to update. Now it's just a matter of fixing things. We are now going to add lifecycle method to a class. In application with many components, it is very important to free up resources taken by the component when they are destroyed. We want to set up a timer whenever the clock is rendered to the DOM for the first time. This is called mounting in React. We also want to clear the timer whenever DOM produced by the clock is removed. This is called unmounting in React. We can declare special method on the component class to run some code when a component mounts and unmounts. To we declare component didMount on class as a method, and inside we will set up some logic for the timer. We're also going to need component unmount to free up the spaces. These methods are called lifecycle methods. The component didMount method runs after component output has been rendered to the DOM. This is a good place to set up the timer. Note how we save timer ID right on this as this.timer ID. While this.props is set up by React itself and this.state has a special meaning, you are free to add additional field to the class manually if you need to store something that doesn't participate in data flow. Like in this case, we have timer ID. We will tear down the timer in component will unmount lifecycle method. Finally, we will implement a method called tick that the clock component will run every second. It will use this.setState to schedule update to component local state. Let's see it action. We use this.setState to update the date. Now you can see on your left, the time is updating and now we have a fully functional clock. Let's quickly recap what is going on. Clock is passed to React DOM render. React call the constructor of clock component. Since clock need to display current time, it initializes this.state with an object including current time. We will later update this state. Then React call clock's render method. This is how React learn what should displayed on the screen. React then update the DOM to match clock's render output. When the clock output is inserted in the DOM, React call component didMount lifecycle method. Inside it, the clock set up a timer to call component's tick method once a second. Every second the browser call tick method. Inside it, the clock component schedule a UI update by calling setState. Thanks to setState call, React know the state has changed and call render method again to learn what should the UI look on the screen right now. This time, this.state.date is in the render method will be different. So render output will include the updated time. React update the DOM accordingly. If the clock component is ever removed from DOM, React call component will unmount lifecycle method so that timer will be stopped. We can also find out the timings of different methods which are called during the lifecycle of a React component. So if we refresh, we can see that first constructor had been called, then render method has been called. After the first render, we have our component didMount, which is called just one time. Then our tick method has called because we have set up the timer. Now, because in our tick method we are updating the state of this component, render method is calling again and again every second with updated value. That's it for this lecture, guys. I will see you in the next lecture. Now that we have covered what is a state, how to use it, it will be very beneficial if we know what not to do with the state. So using state correctly is very important. There are 3 things you should know about setState. We should not modify state directly. What do I mean by that? So even though that it is defined as a instance property, this dot state, and there is nothing which is stopping you from just doing this dot state equals to something. This is wrong. Instead, we should always use this dot set state. The only place where you can assign this dot state is in the components constructor. State updates may be asynchronous. React may batch multiple this dot set state call into a single update for performance reasons. Because this dot props and this dot state may be updated asynchronously, you should not rely on their values for calculation of next state. If we look at this example, it is wrong. To fix it, use a second form of set state that accepts a function rather than an object. That function will receive the previous state as the first argument and the props at the time the update is applied as the second argument. So the correct way of doing this would be this will be the right way to use it. We use an arrow function above, but it also works with the regular function. State updates are merged. When you call this dot set state, React merge the object you provide into this current state. For example, your state may contain several independent variables. For example, if instead just for date, we also have something like name, inside this tick method we are just updating the state. You can see on the left, even though we are updating date every single second, the name remains the same. That is because React this dot set state uses merge instead of just replacing the object. Now that our clock is an encapsulated component, we can render as much as we want, and one component of clock, one instance of clock should not consider any consequences of another instance of that clock. So for example, if we have another component called app, which will simply render multiple instances of this component, and instead of clock we render app, our UI look something like this. It is not a very good example, but every single one of these clock component have its own state and managing it by itself. So it is completely isolated and encapsulated. Hope you enjoy this lecture. See you soon. Hello and welcome to React 101. In this lecture, we are going to learn how to do event handling in React. Handling event in React element is very similar to handling events on DOM elements. There are few syntactic difference. In case of React, events are named camel case rather than row or case. For example, if you look at this snippet of code as an HTML code, you can see that in button element we have a attribute called onClick which is an event handler, which is an event, and we are passing an handler activate lasers. We are passing this handler as a string. But if you look at the corresponding code in JSX, you will see that onClick is no longer a lowercase, it is as camel case. And we are also passing the function handler activate laser as a reference instead of passing it as a string. Another difference is that you cannot return false to prevent default behavior in React. You must call prevent default explicitly. For example, if you look at this HTML code where we have a anchor tag and we add a onClick event, inside that event we are logging some text and returning false. This will prevent the default behavior of this link. As opposed to if we convert it in a React element, we pass handle click as a function instead of a string to onClick attribute. You can see that we are using this event.prevent default instead of returning false. If I remove this prevent default, the default behavior of this link will to follow the hyper reference. As you can see, the URL has changed. Or if we don't use prevent default, it will lead us to Google's homepage. In case of React element, you do need to use this prevent default mechanism to overriding the default behavior. Here E is a synthetic event. React defines these synthetic events according to the W3C spec. So you don't have to worry about cross compatibility issue for the browser. When using React, you generally don't need to call add event listener to add listeners to a DOM element. Instead, you just pass a listener like we are doing here on line number 11. Here we are using a component using function. We can also use class components. Let's say we define a class component called toggle. We set a state in constructor and initialize it to true. Toggle is on. And inside of render method, we are toggling the button state from on to off. To achieve this behavior, we use onClick on this button and we pass this.handleClick as an event handler. You can define a handler on a class as an instance method and use it with this.function name, this.method name. Inside of this method event handler, we are just toggling the state of isToggle on. If you look carefully on line number 9, 10, we are binding this method with this. This is very important. If you don't bind this context, the event handler is not going to call properly in the callback. That is, if you don't bind this to a method and pass it as an event handler, this will be undefined and you won't get the desired result. As you can see, after removing the bind, I'm no longer able to use this, and JavaScript is throwing an error saying that there is no this inside handle click method. When working with class component, you must bind the method. This is not a limitation to React. It is how functions work in JavaScript. If you don't want to use bind, you can also use an experiment feature in classes ES6 JavaScript class called public property, public class field syntax. In this case, you don't have to bind this. If you don't want to use the public class field property either, you can simply use arrow function inside the event. Instead of passing event handler, the class method directly, you can use an arrow function and then call the class method inside of that arrow function. This will work. Only downside with this approach is that on every render a new callback will be passed. That won't cause a problem in most of the cases, but if you pass a event handler which use arrow function and pass it down to the children as a prop, those children might get re-rendered because of that changing callback.